Welcome guys to another episode with the Doomed Hell, and yes, it is 2022 and I've decided to change up the intro. Guys, today I relish the fact that I've gotten a gigantic computer upgrade in the form of a new CPU, motherboard, more RAM, better CPU cooler, and basically I have gone through a complete computer upgrade from the case to the power supply, etc, etc, and I'm very glad of that due to some personal reasons, but also just because I get more power to play with. But I'd like to definitely talk about my previous computer and kind of go through the history of my what ended up being a $500 computer. This might be a long-winded video, but if you do like used parts stories, I think it is something that you might appreciate. Now, a little bit of background about me. Ever since I was about 11 or 12, I was really into computers. They opened up new windows that I never really thought existed. This all kind of happened because some of my classmates at the time played video games on their computers, and they suggested me some games. The main couple titles that I was suggested at the time was Far Cry, Battlefield, Portal, and eventually Garry's Mod. And Garry's Mod is one of those games that I grew very fond of, along with Counter-Strike Source, Minecraft, and a couple other titles. Garry's Mod was a lot of fun, but running it on a pretty old quad-core processor that wasn't exactly clocked all that well, and I didn't have all that much memory. It was a bit hard at times to run it. Afterwards, I started working around 15-16 in computer factories and just working closer with computers. And I ended up building a shit ton of computers, and I think most of my knowledge, practical knowledge at least, with computers kind of developed around that time. And then later on, I ended up building a computer with my dad, who needed at the time an upgrade because his quad core was not really, at the task of what he was trying to accomplish at work and on his personal projects. And then finally, when I ended up going to university, I ended up realizing that I would need my own personal computer because my laptop wasn't going to cut it at the time. So in late 2018, during the summer, I ended up building my very first version of this computer, which I ended up fondly calling the Pyromancer. The Pyromancer had a couple of tasks that it had to accomplish. For one, it had to be capable of running Sony Vegas at decent amounts of speeds. Now, Sony Vegas at this time, my version was a 2011, 2012, and so it didn't really have to have all that much juice, it just had to run it smoothly. Secondly, it needed to be able to run games around that kind of performance as well. Smoothly, not too good, not too bad. And I ended up realizing that I wanted ultra wide performance, that is 1080p ultra wide, and I wanted to be able to run those kinds of settings, maybe on high on single player games and low on multiplayer games, and still be able to smoothly play them. And of course, I needed a lot more RAM, and I needed super fast storage. So I ended up going with something that was a bit special. I went with a dual CPU based computer, and I did that for a couple of reasons. At the time, buying two CPUs was almost as cheap as buying one. That is, a board that can fit one CPU on was almost as cheap as a board that can fit two. Now, at first I wasn't so worried about the overclocking headroom. I wanted to end up getting an EVGA SR2 motherboard, but of course at the time they were about $500. This is 2018, back when Ryzen had just come out, or very recently had come out, and so for obvious reasons I couldn't just go with an SR2. But I knew that I wanted the whole package, and I ended up finding an amazing deal. It was $200 on eBay for dual 5670 CPUs, 24 gigs of ECC RAM, which I didn't know at the time, but I ended up figuring it out later, and an Asus motherboard. Now, I didn't have that all that much time to understand exactly what I could do, where I could overclock with this board, and I ended up regretting it very strongly. But I thought that maybe later on I could potentially put on a BIOS and set FSB at least these CPUs. So I ended up jumping the gun and buying the motherboard, the CPUs, the RAM, and the CPU coolers, of course, already put on the computer for very modest price, $200. I mean, afterwards I needed a good graphics card, and the market was stable, but I would say a little high for the time, as I was used to more like 2016, 2017 prices. Yes, this was post Bitcoin extravaganza part 2. We've had 3 major Bitcoin waves, one in 2012, 2013, one in 2017, 2018, maybe even 2019 if you really want to cut it there, and obviously the one we have today. And the 2018 one at the time felt extremely rough. The prices had kind of gone up for some of the NVIDIA GPUs, and some of the AMD GPUs were definitely seeing some of the prices go up. And I felt very lucky that I started buying them really when it was at the lowest. I ended up getting an R9 290 Tri-X 4GB version, of course, for just around $180, which at the time I felt was very cheap. Now, keep in mind that a couple years before that, I could have bought one for $400. So the price difference was immense, and considering the driver support was extremely good at the time, basically the same as an RX 580, I was extremely happy with my purchase. I even knew about core unlocking my GPU, so very, very happy. And that's when I realized that I couldn't really get a case, power supply, and SSD for nowhere near that quality or that performance that I wanted for a good price on the used market. And so, looking at my time, realizing that university was starting and I was soon going to get my exams, I needed to figure out something quick. And I decided to go with buying my parts on Canada Computers. I ended up going with a 1TB Samsung 850 EVO SSD, which at the time was about $200. I bought the cheapest glass case I could find. I thought glass was nice, but I also wanted a case that I could fit my dual CPU motherboard in it, and I found the Mattrexx 55 was just perfect for that. I also ended up going with a EVGA 850 GQ power supply, as those were on sale at the time. So all in all, my computer only really cost me about $600 to $650. And I thought that was an amazing deal. And you know what? It was a great deal. That was one of the best deals I've had ever done. Either witnessing it or doing it myself online or PC Part Picker. And I knew right then and there that this was Pyromaniak, the legendary computer that I sought after for years and years and years. And my very first computer. I was very happy with the performance I got until the very day I ended up booting up Far Cry 3 and starting to play. And that's when I realized that it is necessary for Xeon X58 CPUs to be overclocked to have any chance against modern games. And Far Cry 3 was a great example of it. Now, I did have a lot of cores in my computer, and I had an okay amount of IPC, but the clock rate of the CPUs were just not cutting it for modern games. I think I was only getting about 3 to 3.3 gigahertz. And Far Cry 3, if you guys don't know, only really uses 2 cores. So imagine me having 12 cores and 24 threads, only using 2 of those cores. I was very disappointed, and the game really didn't like me. Now, to be fair, I didn't really care at the time because micro stutters were not that important to me, especially in these kinds of games. And I was able to beat the game on hard difficulty just as I did years prior. So I was very happy overall. It was definitely a better experience than when I played it on Xbox 360, of course. But I knew that there was more to be desired. Now, side note here, when I played Far Cry 4, obviously the stutter wasn't as noticeable. I do think I was using at least 6 cores, which was really, really nice. But I knew that if I wanted to go forward with my Xeon processors, I absolutely needed to run a single CPU instead of 2, and to get that overclocking going. So I ended up looking online to find good deals for X58 and realized that the SR2s were still way too expensive. I knew that at this point it was not going to happen anytime soon. Me getting 2 SR2s, probably not going to happen. And so I ended up looking for other X58 motherboards. And I did stumble upon one that was very close to my university and was a Rampage 3 Extreme. Now, I was a pretty big Asus fan at the time. I really liked their product line. I liked the look of their motherboards, and I knew a lot about their Extreme lineups and how great those motherboards were. So looking at a Rampage 3 Extreme, which still had a lot of space for my RAM and was fairly powerful for the time, I was extremely happy. Extremely. So I ended up selling my motherboard with the extra CPUs which I got with the motherboard. Like I said, that board was an amazing deal, and I ended up keeping the 2 6 cores with me, keeping them for later, of course, when I got my SR2, and I ended up buying the Rampage 3 Extreme right then and there. But what did I do during that time? Well, firstly, I had to get a bus that day. I remember that. And I remember me going to a graduate's dorm, which was specifically in the health sciences, and meeting with this very nice doctor who told me of the great stories of modding Minecraft and playing with his friends on his server. Of course, using this motherboard. And when I looked at the motherboard, it was definitely in one of the best conditions I saw with my own eyes. You know, me working in used factories and probably seeing, out of the 300 plus computers I had built, only seeing about 2 or 3 motherboards that were brand new. So looking at this board, I was already very impressed. And it came with an i7 quad core, which I still have in my catalog of hoarded stuff at this point, which I have to sell at some point. So I was extremely happy, and I ended up buying the board right then and there, and it cost me less than the dual CPU board I had bought previously. So I was very happy. It only cost me $160, so I made about $50 to $60. Very happy. When I came home and I decided to build my computer finally, I realized there was a little problem. My RAM is ECC RAM, and so that's when I panicked and had to panic buy some RAM. I ended up buying, I think it was 16 gigs of DDR3 for about $20, but it ended up only 10 gigabytes actually worked, and I was very frustrated about that. So I ended up just running that RAM stock, and I never ended up overclocking that Rampage 3 because I was, scared that the RAM would blow up if I did anything specific to the RAM. Now that was a huge mistake because, to be honest, I would have wished I tried out that Rampage 3. And the reality of it is that situation ended up pretty horribly. But that's later in the story. Now let's get back on topic. We are now early 2019 when I did all these things. And around early 2020, I ended up tweaking my computer some more. Now the prices of the R9 290s have really dropped at around $100. And I saw the R9 Furies get extremely cheap on eBay and locally. But of course less locally because there were not as many Furies that were sold than the 290s, of course. So I ended up going on eBay and buying my R9 Fury Strix for the same price I bought my R9 290 Tri-X all those years ago. Actually, it was cheaper. It was around $160 with the shipping. Absolutely insane deal. So I bought this Strix knowing full-fledged that I would someday core unlock it, and I gave my R9 290 to my cousin, which I ended up selling later, by the way, to around $250. So I ended up making profit with that little shenanigan there. And of course, a week later, I saw an R9 Fury X that was around $120 and proven, tested to be functional. So of course I had to jump the gun on that one as well, wanting to run Crossfire. And the story with that one is that it came in the mail and basically the liquid cooler was broken. So I was very frustrated and ended up shelving it. And it is still shelved to this day. I have a video about it recently. So at this point I was very happy, but realizing that my 1 terabyte SSD is pretty much filled to the brim with games and recordings of myself, I knew that I had to buy a new hard drive. And looking at the prices of 4 terabyte hard drives, they were getting very cheap. I ended up buying a Barracuda Pro 4 terabyte, 5400 RPM, and that thing did me for a little while. And recently I had to shelve it as an archive drive because the performance is not as fast as I wish it were, and I think I started eating up the cache to the point where it no longer uses the cache when I want it to. It will actually run at like 2 to 3 megabits per second transfer speeds if I'm not careful, if the cache is full. And this has happened to me multiple times. I was very unhappy and I ended up panic buying another hard drive, but that's later in the story. And so after a while using my X5670 and my R9 Fury Strix, I started having some issues. And at this time, COVID was already going along, and I didn't understand why I was getting some very weird shutdown issues with my computer. I started getting scared and not really looking at the problems the way they might be. I decided to instead sell my motherboard and my CPU and everything that came with it and buy something completely new. Now at the time I had an FX8350 and a Sabertooth motherboard waiting for me, which I had bought only for $50 and made that money back by selling the liquid cooler that came with it. It came with an H60, Corsair H60, and that thing I sold for $70. So that thing was free basically. I made $20 off that. I ended up deciding that I wanted to put that in my main rig and just buying some 16 gigs of overclocker RAM and see what I could do with that. Obviously 8 cores is good. It's not as good as the 6 cores from Intel, the X58, but overclocked I knew that the FX processor would do pretty well for modern gaming, and I just hope that it wouldn't really bother me as much as the shutting down of the Rampage 3 would affect me. So I ended up in late 2020, I ended up putting my FX processor in my computer. I bought Trident X RAM for $200, and I was running that stable for about 2 seconds, because later that month I realized that my FX processor and my Sabertooth had some issues. The computer refused to run the very simple DOCP settings of the 16 gigs of RAM. It is Trident X 2133 at the time, and it refused to run my very mild FX overclocking. And I think that was because I started playing with the North Bridge. But the reality of it is that what I should have actually done is cleaned up the Sabertooth board and realized that, hold on a second, this board is actually broken. Something is broken on the board and I can't run it this way. So the board was kaput, and I wanted to keep the processor, but I ended up realizing it's better if I sold it as a set. And I ended up selling it to a guy who absolutely needed the processor and was hoping that the motherboard might work for him, which obviously it didn't, for about $120. I was very, very happy. I made my money back a little bit with the RAM. At this point, my RAM costing me $80, minus the 20 which I had already used up, minus the $60 as well. And you can see that I'm basically, I don't have a motherboard or a CPU, but I basically made my money over the years. I'm still around $500 to $600. And that's when I decided, and that's when obviously I needed a new motherboard. So what I ended up doing is I went online and I looked for one that cost around $100 $100, and I ended up stumbling upon an FX8350, just like earlier, and a Crosshair 5 Formula Z, which was one of my favorite boards from the 990FX series. So obviously I had to buy it, add that money back, let's say $100, and I basically have a $600 to $700 great gaming computer. At this point, I ended up around early 2021. I ended up core unlocking my Fury Strix, which I've made videos about. But of course, I had to buy a new 4TB Western Digital black hard drive because of some issues which happened. So that entire story aside, how much did that computer really cost me in the end? Well, from everything I have bought and sold throughout the years, without the hard drives, I don't think I'll consider the hard drives because those were very expensive and I use them still. The entire computer really only cost me $400 when we started, and when I ended up putting all the pieces together, it only really cost me $350. That's all in all, with all the profits and all the drops I had done. Now, for a computer that had lasted me for 3 years, and I was able to play a lot of games in 4K, 1440p, and 1080p depending on the game, I think that is worth it. Now, we are 2022, so technically it was 4 years, but with all that time I wasted trying to fix it and stuff, you can say 3 years was about that time. And of course, I have to let it go. Now, I'm not selling it. I am going to keep it. I'm giving it to my girlfriend. I bought a GTX 680 4GB version for around $120, which is not that bad looking at the market. But of course, I wish I had an R9 290 for that price. But very happy that I was able to buy that, and that computer in the end was a true Pyromaniak. It's currently running at 4.5 gigahertz. The DDR3 originally was at 2133. I ended up overclocking it to 2400, which was really only an XMP overload because they did sell one of the versions of the Trident X at 2400 CL10 1212, which is exactly what I set it to. So I didn't really do anything crazy, but I ended up getting it to 2500 CL 1211. No, sorry, not 12. 10, 11, 10, I believe. 32. And that was very good for some basic tasks. I ended up switching out that RAM. I now have 64 gigs of Trident X in my own computer, and I put some Ripjaws V 4GB modules, so I might be able to run that 2500 megahertz again. We'll see. The R9 Fury Strix obviously was put in my computer. The GTX 680, we will be running a mild to advanced overclock on it as it is a palette triple fan version, so I'll be really happy doing that. Overall, it was a great computer. It is going to be running a 500 gig SSD now, and it's going to be running probably some Warzone, Minecraft, games like that. And getting to my new computer, I am really happy that I got a new computer, but considering the price difference, I mean, this computer is almost twice as expensive as my previous computer. At least the CPU, motherboard, and extra RAM cost me maybe $600. That's without the heatsink, the water block, which I'm going to be selling. So there is a huge price difference between the FX processor and my new i7 Extreme processor. But what I will say is that the FX had just horrible performance when it came to Vegas rendering, and that's something I'm really happy I am getting out of the i7 Extreme. The FX, however, just gave me a good bang for buck. It was capable of keeping me to the edge, and keeping me interested in overclocking it and further getting performance while I wait till I get more budget. Now, did I really have more budget in the end? No, I just kind of felt the need that I needed to buy a new computer, as my old computer was still having some shutdown issues and it was just not responding. Now, obviously, I could change the power supply and do all these things, but since I had dealt with it before and I thought I had finished it, it's starting to piss me off, let's just say. So, going back to the Pyromaniak, I will be having some I will be doing some overclocking onto it and trying to get it to 5.1 gigahertz. I have an H80 liquid cooler, which I am going to be putting onto it. For how much that computer cost me, it was worth it. It was worth every dime. Absolute beast. End on end. I wish I had picked a better platform from the get-go. Probably would have saved some money in the end, but considering how much fun I had with it, I guess it was just worth it. Did I wish I had an SR2 motherboard instead of the original dual CPU motherboard I used? Absolutely. I don't think anyone would have not, right? It's one of the best motherboards ever. And in the future, I am looking forward to potentially buying an SR3 motherboard when I do get into custom looping and getting into high-end computing. But I am very happy with what I have today. It's probably one of the best computers I could have bought for my dime. So that's the story of the Pyromaniak. I hope you guys enjoyed. Please comment your favorite used computer or even new computer stories if you have any. I know that my new computer has an incredible story already from the last 2-3 weeks that I've been working on, and it's always interesting to see, right? So I just really hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I'll definitely make some more, and have a good day.